also academic, I'm also a professor, so I know that at this time of the year, we are all as academics tired. We probably are toward the end of the year when we are very busy as well. So I appreciate the time you availed for me to come and listen to me sharing with you some thoughts about my book. I'm wholeheartedly grateful to Christoph for availing this to me so spontaneously like that. I just wrote to him and I said, this time I got a passport so I can travel. I come from a Syrian background, so I was a bit prevented from traveling before. So I told him I missed the chance of meeting with you 2 years ago when you generously invited me for a conference. So I would be glad to have a cup of coffee with you this time. I'm in Vienna. And then he said to me, how about coming and telling us about your book? And so I'm grateful. Thank you very much for that. Let me first share with you what I'm going to do here. What do I do in Book Talk? Now, Book Talk for me is not necessarily about the content of the book, because the content of the book is something which I aspire at encouraging you to read by yourselves. So for me, Book Talk is to share with you what are the motivating ideas, what are the challenging questions, what are some of the academic trends of thought which I struggled with in the writings of other academics and drove me to write that book. Why writing another book, yet another book on John of Damascus? And as you know, there are so many books already. I mean, as Christopher just saying, you just stumble over a chapter on John of Damascus in any book you read. So what I'm going to share with you is first sort of an introductory background on how I came into writing that project. And then I will ask the question, why do I title my book Umayyad Christianity? And then the other question will be, why John of Damascus? To speak about Umayyad Christianity. Why not other figure? So basically, I'm gonna just share with you all these, all that rational journey I made myself toward producing the book. And I hope that will be inviting enough for you to maybe read the book later on your own. And if you had the chance to read the book, I will, of course, gladly welcome your comments after I finish, your feedback, your questions about it or about anything I would say. First, that personal journey, which I call bringing John of Damascus home. That's what I personally claim myself doing, bringing John of Damascus home. And that should take us back. If you want to know the story of that, I have to take you back to 2014 actually. In early summer 2014, I finished writing my monograph on Theodore Abu Qurra, Orthodoxy in Arabic Terms, which was published by De Gruyter in 2015. I spent the previous years before 2014, almost 4 years before that, digging as deeply as I could into the theological legacy of this Eastern Syrian father. Now, these 4 years of research on Theodore Abu Qurra made me discover the profound extent of his theological relation to two other great theologians from that part of the world, John of Damascus and Maximus Confessor. The depth of Abu Qurra's reliance on the Damascene theological legacy not only magnetized my mind strongly to Abu Qurra thought, it equally opened my eyes widely on the great legacy of John of Damascus himself. I decided since then to embark on spending the ensuing years in a serious and careful study of the character and ideas of the great Christian child of Damascus and churchman of Palestine. So here I am, after the past few years of painstaking research on John of Damascus, daring to put this monograph on this church figure from my homeland, from Syria, in the hands of the reader. This is a monograph written definitely from a critical, analytical, and meticulous investigation perspective, but it's also written with far from hidden or suppressed passion, intimacy, and engagement. So I allowed myself to be a postmodernist rather than a modernist author, if you want. I'm not just writing a book from a purely neutral and coldly objective perspective of someone who is not personally related to the research's subject matter. I'm also pursuing this neutral and objective task with sharp sensitivity to John of Damascus, the human person, not just the mind, the historical figure from particular Zitzim labor, not just the presumed author of certain extant texts, the Christian of a particular local community, not just the Christian representative of a universalized preserved tradition. It is the human person of that context, namely Syria, again my homeland. It is the human person of that life setting that I am trying in my book to put center stage and to introduce. Little are, as you know, the available information about Yana's life in our hands, since his excellent medieval biographies are also hagiographical in focus and in intent. Yet what we know tells us at least that we have here a person who comes from a Syrian family called Mansour family, who enjoyed close relations with the Muslim Umayyad ruling dynasty that granted that family high rank position in the caliphal court and the caliph's governing cabinet. We do know that Yanna himself, as we read in some Muslim extant texts, served the caliphal court as a member of the financial administration, but also as a close advisor and close companion to more than one Umayyad caliph. It's also believed that our Yanna left the caliphal court and Damascus at one point of his life, during the senior years of his life, and decided to dedicate the rest of his life to serve as a theologian, to serve church circles, a theologian, as a spiritualist, and as sort of ecclesial servant. He did this by retiring either to the monastery of Marsabas near Jerusalem or to the circles of Christian groups that were associated with this monastic center. We also know that he left behind various theological, spiritual, and liturgical writings, all in Greek language, most important of which is his Magnus Opus, the Fount of Knowledge, Pegignosios, which is a trilogy, as you know, contains in its third volume on heresies, the Heresibos, one of the most, in my opinion, most intriguing and rather seriously puzzling early Christian texts on Islam we have extant in our hands today. Actually, reading that puzzling text invited me to ask myself whether interpreting that text theologically is the right way. In my book, I argue that actually the best way to understand what John of Damascus is doing there is not to read that book as a theological discourse. I think it hardly contains true theology. It's more a text that is written from a purely cultural, contextual, Christian-Muslim dynamic perspective. Now that does not automatically mean any Christian-Muslim dynamic perspective is theological in nature. That's something we should pay attention to, I believe, when we read John of Damascus's text. So my monograph is a monograph on John of Damascus that is bringing this great church father, as I said, back home. It dares to claim our saint back to us, the Syrians, the indigenous people of Syria, Palestine, not just demographically, but also intellectually. It dares to treat him and the texts he left behind as records of our history, our suffering, our identity formation journey. And it dares to do that after, in scholarship, decades of Byzantinizing his legacy and mind and imposing on his personality, worldviews, allegiances, and traditions, which he never ignored or undermined, yet he cannot be deemed so easily as a guardian for and representative of. As if this great churchman was telepathically living in Constantinople and not in the dramatically transforming and quaking land of the Umayyad Syrian Palestine. I wrote this book on John of Damascus, hoping at launching a conversation. Gespräch. I hope that my monograph will humbly pave the way for a new controversy on John of Damascus. Who said controversies are bad in academics? They are probably the most inviting elements that make PhD students find subjects to write about. Now, if I succeeded in creating such a debate, then my mission is, modestly speaking, accomplished. For me personally, if I succeeded in bringing John of Damascus back home, this will be the greatest reward ever. So that's the personal dimension, why I am sort of attached to that subject. And I'm not shy about saying I did it as an academic scientist, but also I did it as someone who is keen on understanding that person and that Christianity also personally. Because it helps me to understand where I come from. You know, that's my land, that's my identity, that's my background. So understanding John of Damascus will enable me to understand who we are as Christians in the Middle East today, and why we are this Christians and not others. So that's why I'm not shy about that at all in my book. Now let me come to the question, why Umayyad Christianity? Why do I use that title? Why I title my monograph Umayyad Christianity, and why don't I opt for a title like Christianity under the Umayyad rule, for example, or Christianity in early Islamic era? Now, scholars of Christianity during the Muslim era in the Middle East and in the world tend habitually to speak about these religious communities, Christians and Muslims, as self-enclosed, self-otherizing religions standing side by side in the same geographical setting. So they tend to always speak about Christianity under the rule of Islam, or Christianity in the shadow of Islam, or even Christianity surviving Islam. The Christians and Muslims who lived in the Islamic context of the 7th and 8th centuries are believed to have existed in that Sitzenleben as separate entities who are only dialectically connected to each other. Just to give you some examples which we read in scholarship available today, David Thomas, for example, in his book on Christian doctrines in Islamic theology, he suggests, when you read the introduction of that book, he suggests there that the Christian professionals were thus respected and courted for the expertise they could give. But whether this meant they were greeted and welcomed is not at all clear. The Christians were legally dhimmis, protected people, and governed by regulations that might be enforced at any time to make them adhere to their separate status. End of quote. The dividing lines between Christians and Muslims, David Thomas claims, were sharpened to restrain the Christians from full participation in the life of the Caliph. In his turn, Robert Hoyland, also in his essay Jacob of Edessa on Islam, concurs with Thomas's reading. He suggests that in their existence in one living context, the Christians and Muslims seemed like two parallel worlds. The Arabian one of feuds, raids, and tribal councils imply floating above that of the Christian Near East, with little exchange between them beyond taxes and prisoners of war. And commenting on and actually against that sort of trend in a recent, few years ago, a book published in 2015, Michael Penn describes that way of understanding the relation between Christians and Jews in what he says a Hegelian-like dialectic or parallel worlds view. And he speaks about it in his book Envisioning Islam by saying, most historical reconstructions of Christian-Muslim relations exclude from consideration the largest corpus of early documents about Islam. Instead, studies most commonly focus on works whose martial context often reinforces an oppositional clash of civilizations model of interreligious encounter. Even when scholars investigate the reciprocal possible impact each religion left on the creation and evolvement of the other, they still speak about this influence as something stemming from one religiously ulterior group interacting with a totally exterior, parallel, and opposite other. It's hardly the case that Christian and Muslim intellectualism in early Islam is viewed and deemed as two components or forms of one and the very same cultural koine, cultural identity formation, or trans-religious process. This is why most Western and Eastern scholars speak about Christianity under Islam, or Christianity in the shadow of Islam, or Christianity in particular Muslim era, or Christianity under specific Muslim rule, etc., etc., as if the Christians happened to exist in a broader politically, socially, and religiously dominant Muslim context, and were obliged to seek consistent survival by all pragmatic means possible in it. Umayyad Christianity wants to clearly withstand this dialectic view in scholarship. It is a monograph that attempts at following an invitation the scholar of Arabic studies Sarah Stromza has tendered recently to today's scholars. Stromza suggests that the creation of the Umayyad and Abbasid cultural milieu was actually a multiform manifestation of a single endeavor. Thus, it should not be categorized and studied according to religious affiliations. Stromza eloquently warns that isolating one communal segment of the intricate picture of the Islamic world's complex intellectual history is comparable to looking with one eye. The resulting image is meaningful and may appear coherent, but it is in fact flat and incomplete. Umayyad Christianity wants to show that far from division and isolation, the Christians of Greater Syria during the 7th and 8th and early 8th centuries did not consider themselves alien community of strangers living under a more powerful, totally dominant, counter-religious reality called Islam. The Christians of Syria-Palestine considered themselves part and parcel of the radical transformations that took place in that region during the 7th century AD. In my book, I propose that the best methodological strategy that enables us to highlight the deep involvement and belonging of the Christians of Syria-Palestine in the creation of a new civilization in their homeland during the 7th century is a methodology which I call from context to text methodology. That methodology reads the extant Christian texts we have from that era, not in their narrow and limited literary and linguistic frameworks, but within the broader framework of the socio-cultural and identity formation context of the historical era and setting that drove their authors to write them. This methodology, as I demonstrate at length in my book, makes us realize that the Christians of that region considered themselves co-creators of the Umayyad civilizational, cultural, and social identity, and viewed themselves as Umayyad co-citizens with Muslims in one growing empire. The intermingling and coexisting symbiosis between the Christians and Muslims of Umayyad on the cultural, societal, political, and civil levels are far more evident than scholars tended to admit until very recently. Methodologically, I achieved the above purpose in my book by proposing, as I said, that from context to text approach to the history of the Christians during early Islam. That method I propose in my study, I believe paves the way for realizing that the Chalcedonian Christians of Syria, Palestine during the Umayyad rule may not have been as adherent to Hellenic Byzantine Christianity as we may think. Even if the literature of these Christian prelates was composed in Greek language and not in Arabic language of the Muslim rulers. There are considerable contextual data from the Umayyad Sitzimleben which allow us to believe that the Syro-Palestinian Christians, many of whom came from the tribes and communities of the extended Arabia, did not really image the cultural, social, artistic, and intellectual webs of meaning of the Constantinopolitan, Hellenic, or even Persian Sasanian Christianities. Rather, they opted for a particular cultural, social, and intellectual identity that positioned them in natural affinity with the Arabs of the invading Muslim power. It is not far from truth that this affinity did not seem to have succeeded in driving these Christians to establish many detectable or evident Arab church. We don't have really enough historical or archaeological data that will make us confidently speak about an Arab church at that era. But this notwithstanding, these Christians were keen to form an ecclesial identity to reflect unembarrassingly their cultural and existential rootedness in the very same Arabic Sitzimleben of Syria, Palestine, to which both their tribes and the tribal background of their Muslim setting equally belonged. Both the Christians and the Muslims in the early Umayyad era explicitly acknowledged and embraced the Syrian cultural features of their indigenous life setting and formed a particular Umayyad identity beyond religious narrowness upon them. This applied not only to the Aramaic Christians who spoke Arabic and Aramaic, but also to the Aramaic Christians such as John of Damascus and his family, whose spoken language was Greek. Also, this does not merely apply to the Melkite Chalcedonian Christians, but also to Nestorians and Monophysites in that region. One can recognize a Muslim community over and against or in parallel with a Christian community, and so a religious plurality in the Umayyad context. That's correct. However, the congregations of these two religions did not live like two separate, parallel communities on the cultural, social, and life-setting levels. Rather, they were all members of the same common Syrian context that was still part and parcel of late antiquity. Now I come to the other question I told you I would like to touch upon, which is why John of Damascus and no other? Why do I focus on John of Damascus in specific to make a case for the thesis of my monograph? What is really unique about this Christian figure? Now I think what is unique about him is the way we like to speak of John of Damascus in today's scholarship, which was for me quite challenging. What motivated me to write a book on Umayyad Christianity by focusing on John of Damascus was primarily my critical disagreement with classical Western scholarship on this Christian figure. John of Damascus is a very popular case study in Western classical scholarship on Christian patristic tradition on Eastern Christianity and on Byzantine and in Byzantine studies. When scholars from these areas of study visit the 7th century, whether to study the early chapters of the story of the Islamic Umayyad Empire, or to study Christianity in late antiquity and during the Middle Byzantine era, they pose at the life and intellectual contribution of John of Damascus. For the majority of these scholars, this prolific character presents a very important bridge in the history of Christian theology and life in the Middle Near East between Byzantine Christianity and indigenous Eastern Christianity that was born and evolved in the shadow of early Islam. Eventually, the dominant consideration among them is that John of Damascus is a Greek theologian and poet, a chief Byzantine poet, even a Byzantine churchman who felt he belonged to Byzantium. Scholars holding this conviction go as far as believing that John is a representative of a determining period in the development of the Byzantine theological tradition, or an exemplary Hellenic voice at the crossroads of the dialogue between Hellenism and Arabic culture, or even an exemplary case of the encounter between Byzantium and Islam in the sphere of religion, who was, in mind and heart, according to this view, still living in Byzantium. In Umayyad Christianity, I use the from context into text hermeneutic method to reread John of Damascus's extant literature in a way that grounds his mind and personality in the soil of his Muslim Umayyad Zitzimleben. The Zitzimleben of the Christian figure known as Yanna Mansur al-Dimashqi ibn Sargon ibn Mansur al-Rumi suggests that this Christian was most probably far from a Byzantine in heart and mind in the land of Islam. He is far, that is, from being an alien person surviving in a totally foreign sphere to which he insisted not to belong and into which he refused to even integrate. Rather, John of Damascus was a Christian Malkite Mawla of the Umayyad Caliphs, who was born and who lived in Damascus and who belonged in heart and mind to its Umayyad context. John of Damascus must exemplify a very unique, revolutionary, and precious representation of what I believe can validly be called an Umayyad Christianity. From the wake of the Islamic civilization and state in the Near East. The methodological approach of from context into text I have proposed in this study is the one that enables us to realize this potential and to perceive its highly significant and groundbreaking value in presenting a new, more authentic reading and understanding of the Christian figure called John of Damascus and the Syrian Christian community during the 7th and 8th century Umayyad era. Such a realization can only be apprehended and conceded when one concurrently adopts Conrad Herschler's conviction that the authors of late antiquity, just like authors of other periods for this matter, were active interpreters of their society. Herschler says, active interpreters of their society who sought to make sense of their social context by presenting it in coherent narratives. Herschler says, coherent narratives. It is within the framework of from context to text methodology that I reread John of Damascus's writing on Islam in his book, De Heresibus. That text, as you know, that chapter 100 or 101 is known with the title, The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. Now, the traditional appraisal of this text in scholarship states that it is a perfect example of a Christian theologian presenting a highly learned exposition of Muslim theology and doctrines, and the masterful defense of Christian doctrines over against it. None of that, in my opinion, is the case. The reading I offer to this text demonstrates that John's writ is far from truly theological and doctrinal in nature. It is within also the same framework that I pose and investigate at length in the book some historical data we have on John of Damascus in the cultural, artistic, ecclesial, and historiographical sources from that period. I pose, for example, at the following contextual aspects that are related to John of Damascus. In my book, I first study the tradition of naming and binding in the Umayyad context. Why John of Damascus is presented in Muslim texts as Yamna Mansur al-Dimashqi ibn Sargon ibn Mansur al-Umi. That's his particular Arab bynaming. Why that style of naming and bynaming is used by Christians. So I study in a chapter in my book the background, the contextual and historical data we have on naming and bynaming in early Islam, and how that style of naming was used to give particular cultural, social status for the people who use that nomenclature strategy. So that's something I touch upon, and I try to glean from it some data on the identity formation. Another aspect, contextual aspect I touch upon in my book is the phenomenon of mawali and wala in the Umayyad rule. Wala means loyalty in Arabic. In English. Wala in Arabic means loyalty in English. And mawali means those who pledge loyalty. Now, if you read Ignaz Goldziher, he pinpoints rather accurately two kinds of wala in early Islam, or loyalty in early Islam, or even pre-Islamic Arabia. Something we call wala al-'atq, which means the loyalty of liberation. It is when you liberate a slave from slavery, and then that slave in return will pledge loyalty to you and be freely loyal to you, no more as your slave. So that's wala al-'atq. And then you have wala wala al-muwalat, which means you pledging loyal obedience to someone, not as a slave or not as a liberated slave, but as a free citizen who is now non-Muslim, coming to Muslim ruler or leader or noble person and promising to be loyal and obedient to that person's cause. And that second form of wala is what John of Damascus and his family practiced. And that's why actually they were trusted by the caliphs and they were members in the caliphal court. So they were mawali in that sense. And that tradition of mawali was practiced by the Muslim rulers in the Umayyad period and the Abbasid period, by the way. But in the Umayyad period, it was stronger and clearer. And because of that, they managed to attract many Jew and Christian, highly educated, highly skilled personnel, and commit them to the caliphal work by wala and walat, which means that pledge of obedience to the cause. And John of Damascus, as I argue in my book, is one of those. And that's why he was so, had a high rank position in the caliphate court. So that's another contextual factor which gives us something about the Christians in that period. Of course, as you know, in the Byzantine Synod of 754 extant documents, we have John of Damascus named Saracen-minded, Saraceno-Frone. I also dedicate a chapter in my book to study that notion, not from theological perspective, because I don't think that was, John was named by that name in any theological connotation, but actually from a contextual perspective. So I tried to find places where the term Saraceno-Frone or Saracen-minded was used as a name or nomenclature for other personnel, other figures. Theophanes, for example, uses that term to speak about Leo III and about a Muslim, originally Damascene figure who converted to Christianity and ran away to Byzantium and became close to the emperor and was also called by Theophanes Saraceno-Frone. Now, I study then the language game here and what are the prelates of Synod 754 trying to say by that about John of Damascus. So that's also an aspect, a contextual issue which I touch upon in one chapter. And of course, I also study the educational, intellectual background of John of Damascus. And I also have a chapter there on Syrian paideia, as a rural, actually, paideia over against the urban dominant one, which was at the time of John of Damascus' grandfather, Hellenic paideia. So I also study the clash, the cultural competition between that Syrian paideia and the Hellenic one. Also, I pay attention. I have a long chapter there on John of Damascus in art, in church art, and why they always paint him as someone wearing a turban and with a dark skin. So why? Why is that? Could these features be telling us something about not just John of Damascus, the person, but also about how the Christianity which John of Damascus represents was understood in the mind of the people of that time? So how can art invite us to understand more identity, understand more intellectual self-perception, things like that? And I'm grateful indeed to one scholar in particular who invited me to do that when I exchanged emails on my project with him. I'm talking about Matt Immersiel. Matt Immersiel is along with Mitt Romney, were involved, I think about 7-8 years ago, in a project which they call the Syrian art. And in that project, they studied all the remaining church paintings you can find in old churches in the Middle East and also in the historically Byzantine territories. And they studied how that art is inviting us to understand the Syriac Christianity's impact on Byzantine tradition. And he inspired me actually to pay attention to some of the paintings we still have extant today on John of Damascus. And I'm going to show you 3 paintings. I speak in my book, I show some images in my book, and I study them and I try to analyze them. And I will show you 3 of them here before I end this presentation. I'm finishing soon, I promise. And then, of course, I reread John of Damascus' text on Islam, the heresy of the Ishmaelites. I reread it from also a contextual perspective. I also try to present a contextual reading of his trilogy on the veneration of holy images. But I focus in my book more, I give larger space to his text on the Ishmaelites. For example, I study why would he speak about the Muslims as the Antichrist? Why Antichrist? And And I think to understand that, we need not just to trace the theological meaning of Antichrist, but also how that term was used contextually by Christians in that period, in other literature. For example, who could be that Arian monk? John of Damascus says that Muhammad learned about Christianity from an Arian monk. And who could be that? And I study also other Christian and Muslim literature and try to come with a suggestion of who could be that Arian monk. All the scholars would suggest that this Arian monk is Rahib Bahira, the monk of Bahira. I criticize that hypothesis completely, and I bring a completely new one. I'm not going to tell you. You go and read the book. Also, why would he speak about a story of camel to defame Muslims? Why camel? Why would a story of camel really degrade Muslims? Now that also for me is something we cannot answer unless we go to the context. So I try to read John of Damascus' text on Islam, the only text we have in our hands from him on Islam. Not anymore as a text that will show us an early discourse on Christology and the Trinity or defense of them, because I don't think he's doing that. Why would he speak about the cross? And I try to show there that he's not speaking about salvation and theology of the cross, but about the idea of the crucifixion. Anyway, these are just examples of many things I touch upon in my book. Let me just end with three images I found while I was following Matt Emerson's advice to go and look for paintings and so on. One of these three paintings I'm going to show you, I was lucky to see myself, because it's from Istanbul, and I happened to be there. But the other two, unfortunately, I wasn't able to travel to these two other places. The oldest paintings we have of John of Damascus still remaining in churches go back to 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. That's centuries after John of Damascus' death. But these are the oldest available in our hands of him. And they are very interesting, in my opinion, to tell us something about how John of Damascus was understood by the Christians after his death, and how his memory remained in the mind of these Christians, and what kind of Christianity he sort of represented, and what kind of Christianity they conveyed to us to be representing via these paintings. An example is in Studenica Monastery in Serbia, and the painting goes back to the 13th century. This is how you find John of Damascus painting there. As you can see, turban, dark skin, with what we call, and what those scholars of Syrian art call a Syrian costume. They call it Syrian costume. It's not a typical Byzantine dress, really. It's a Syrian, and that brown color is a color that symbolizes actually the desert. It wants to symbolize a dry, deserty region. And he doesn't carry a whole Bible. I mean, as you know, typical Byzantine saints paintings would have them in their clerical dresses full of crosses, of course, and also carrying the Holy Bible in their hand. But that's not the case with John of Damascus in this church. If another image here shows us the entire painting of John of Damascus in full scale with in a pillar, and if I'm not mistaken, the image on the other side there is of Cosmas of Mayoma, his brother, or his adopted brother, Cosma. We call him in Arabic Cosma. Also head covered, almost to turban. But as I said, I didn't visit myself the church there to tell you exactly, to take a better picture of it. One day I should. One day I should. The other example which I saw was in Istanbul, Turkey, in Kerikami, Kora Church. It's 14th century art tradition. And that church is always, by the way, jammed. So if you happen to go to Istanbul, I would encourage you to go and visit Kerikami. It's still open for visitors. Many tourists can go there, and it's always jammed with tourists. It's very difficult to take photos. And actually, it wasn't easy for me to find that painting because it's not located in the church in any central place. It's very sidely, in a very narrow corner and dark, and it's not really, it's not like giving center stage or central attention to John of Damascus. But again, as you can see, turban with dark skin, and even that corner itself is really very dark, as if he is considered like second or third class saint. It's not like given. And what is interesting is to see the painting of his brother, Cosmas of Mayuma. Look, it is given bigger space. It's sort of more central because you can see it's at the that's a pillar, and then you can come at one point to the church, and on the right side you can see it easily. It's really quite clear, as if that saint Cosma is given more attention, as if he is considered sort of more important. Now, contextually, one can guess maybe why. There are studies which say actually that John of Damascus was iconophile. He would defend icons. He would clearly write about venerating icons without showing any fear toward that because of Islam. There are scholars, and I touch upon in my book also when I speak about the veneration of holy images, there are scholars who argue that Cosma was not iconophile, he was rather iconophobe. He was someone of those Christians who wanted to have a pragmatic approach toward venerating holy images in a Muslim context. Because he felt that if we do that in public, Muslims will persecute us. So we better avoid it if we can. Now, avoiding that, the iconophobe in that region were probably more supported, more favored by the iconoclasts of Byzantium than iconophobes. So that's Constantinople. That's a church in Constantinople, where if you will remember John of Damascus, you will probably remember him as someone who supported icons and who defied the traditional Constantinopolitan theological iconoclastic approach. So probably if you remember him even after centuries, you will not grant him a central location in the church, but you will grant someone who was closer to iconoclasticism in his iconophobic approach, probably more attention. That's a guess. But that's something, I think, paintings, the idea is that paintings can tell us more than we may think. They may invite us to really scratch our minds about why these locations, why one is given more attention than the other. Both of them come from the same region. Both of them come from the same theological churchly context, and both of them, we think, they were within the circle of Jerusalemite Christianity and Marsabas in a way or another. Of course, there are scholars who don't think that John of Damascus was in Marsabas at all. But why? Why is that? So art is inviting us to also think seriously about the context, about the culture, about these elements which written text may not easily tell us about, may not at all tell us about sometimes. So that's another interesting example. And I think it's a beautiful painting and I wish one day I will go and visit that too. In Macedonia, in the fresco of Lamentation, St. Pantelimon Church, this is 12th century, this is earlier. And we have there the image of 5 saints there. We have Theodore the Studite, the central figure there, as you can see, bareheaded in Byzantine dress code. Then you have John of Damascus, the first on the left side, turban, dark skin again, non-Byzantine dress code, and he is, of course, the iconophile and linked to Marsyas. And he is put at the very far end of the central of the central figure, Theodore the Studite. Then beside him we have Cosmas of Mayoma, second on the left, again turban, dark skin, non-Byzantine dress code, but he was iconophobe. So now you have iconophile far, you have iconophobe closer. Then you have Theophanes Graptus, first on the right side, turban, again dark skin, non-Byzantine dress code, and linked to Marsabas again Marsabas. And Joseph the hymnographer, second on right side, turban on the head again, dark skin, is non-Byzantine dress code. So that's a very interesting combination in my view. That's a very interesting combination. Mithar Romney and Van Emersey say this is a combination, artistically speaking, of what they call the Syrian art with the Byzantine art, and that's an influence of Syrian art on the traditional Byzantine art, and that the Byzantine patrons sort of adopted that art and invited artists from Greater Syria to come and paint that, and that's why we have that combination here. I would say it's a cultural combination, but it's also a theological combination, and it gives us an idea about, again, how maybe someone like John of Damascus was remembered in these centuries as not just a theological writer, but also as a figure, as a person. And art is inviting us to probably glean some information about that culture. My suggestion in my book is that these are not just elements about one person. They might be actually inviting us to think about a broader Christian identity, broader Christian cultural background, a certain Christian community which John of Damascus belonged to, lived at one time in history, and lived in that particular context where Islam was prevalent. Now, prevalent in terms of rule, in terms of political power, but also trying to become prevalent culturally. And I think that attempt at becoming prevalent culturally is what made someone like John of Damascus leave the court eventually. Because then, at the second phase of the Umayyad period, when the Umayyad started to not just treat Islam as cultural denominator, but as dogma, then Christians started to feel the social circle is becoming narrower and narrower, and it's sort of pushing them out of it, whether they like it or not. And that's why I think when John of Damascus eventually left the court and left Damascus, he wrote an extremely harsh and aggressive and offensive text on Islam. I think I should stop now. I talked too much. Thank you for listening.